What phrase appears most often during boxing press conferences?
I want to thank Golden Boy Promotions.
I want to thank Al Heyman, want to thank...
I just want to say thank you to Frank and Bob and Queensberry and Top Rank.
I want to thank Golden Boy.
Of course, the most important thing is the fights, but let's not forget who makes them possible. Promoters are the grey cardinals in the world of sports, and their main task is to earn as much money as possible for themselves and their chargers. No one in the history of boxing has ever succeeded in this as Don King did. Coming out of prison and being a nobody, he started to present world champions within a couple of years and built his great empire, which allowed him to earn hundreds of millions of dollars. But at the price of how many lives did he manage to achieve this? Friends, today's video is dedicated to the story of Don King, the most cruel and greedy promoter in the history of the sport. Please don't forget about the likes, comments with forewords, and subscribe to the channel so you will never miss any upcoming videos. Here we go. Early life. Donald King came into the world back in 1931 in a poor neighborhood of Cleveland. The future promoter was the fifth child in a family that just a few years later had to lose its main breadwinner. King Sr. died in an accident at the steel mill, and his wife, after receiving her husband's death benefits, immediately moved the children to a better neighborhood. As you can see, acumen and money management skills were at a genetic level in young Don. Despite progress in the standard of living, the kid always wanted more and at first decided to achieve everything by fair means, going to study at law school. However, pretty soon the enterprising asshole realized that his life is complicated and it takes more than a career as a lawyer to achieve global goals. Along with his buddy George, Don tried many interesting professions, from vegetable trading to brokerage. For example, once he even got inspired by boxing, put on shorts and went to a Golden Gloves tournament, where he flew to the floor already in the first round of the competition. Apparently, at that moment, when King was knocked out, his brain came up with the genius idea of organizing an underground lottery. That's what the guy did, starting to build his gambling pyramid at age of 20. Soon, Don had his first successes, and many Cleveland guys talked about him as the main black guy in the neighborhood. But it wasn't completely smooth sailing. During his career, the future promoter was cited by the police at least 30 times, and in 1954, he shot and killed a robber who tried to rob one of King's locations, but was acquitted by a court for self-defense. In fact, over the years of his criminal adventures, Don has grabbed the gun many times and once himself was almost killed, but a bullet flew near the back of his head, barely grazing him. In the end, it all came down to King beating his partner to death for a $600 debt in 1967.
West on Cedar, and I saw a few hundred feet ahead, man lying on the sidewalk, man standing over him, kicking him in the head. We drove up there immediately, stopped the car, and I jumped out of the vehicle, and the man standing up had a revolver in his hand. So I pulled out my gun. I says, "Drop the gun." He took the gun, threw it on the back trunk of another vehicle that was parked there. I went over immediately and grabbed that gun, and as I did, this gentleman standing up just went over to the man lying down and gave him one vicious kick again right in the head.
This time the court was more principled, and he did go to jail for 3 years and 11 months. In prison, King was like Andy Dufresne, not just doing time, but making and carrying out plans not for escape, but for a new business. Keeping a close eye on all events in the world, he heard about the success of Ali, Fraser, and many others. So, a head full of dark thoughts produced a brilliant idea, and when he was released in 1971, King knew for sure that now he would be a promoter. The beginning of his career as a promoter. In 1971, King was released from prison and immediately set about implementing his clever plan. Being in quite a bad situation, he borrowed money from his former criminal partners, and just a year later, thanks to his mutual connections, he was already able to reach the main shark of this business, Muhammad Ali. In fact, Don had already met the 60s, 70s boxing icon when he invited him to one of his restaurants in the Cleveland area. At that time, Ali was fighting racial discrimination, because of which only whites were allowed in such places, and the quirky King had hustled up and given the star a table in his establishment.
Well, I knew Ali about maybe a year or two before I met Don. I met Don in 60, 61, and I knew Ali before he even fought for any big fights. And was long down through the years before I actually introduced the two together. I probably introduced Ali to Don by telephone.
Don was well aware that at the time he was still a no-name in the boxing world, so he was not in a hurry to become a promoter of the greatest. Instead, the king of gambling organized an exhibition fight for Muhammad, for which he did not take a cent for himself and sent the money he earned to a hospital in his hometown. But please don't be too quick to honor this hero. Of course, King had a plan. With his generous gesture, he gave himself the best possible publicity, as well as attracting increased attention from other boxers. That same 1972, Don began to work with the two biggest names in the heavyweight division, Foreman and Fraser. At first, the deceitful octopus braided his tentacles around the champion, Smoking Joe, and when he lost to the new young star, King, figuratively speaking, put on his "For Foreman Since Childhood" t-shirt and started to do business with him. Just imagine, the strongest members of the King division were concentrated in the hands of such a man in one day. I don't think I need to explain to you that he was going to milk both assets to the max by pairing the boxers with each other. At this point, you've heard a lot about Don King and understand how grasping the money sensitive he is, but your jaw will drop after the next fact. Don has made attempts to arrange a fight between Ali and Fraser in several countries, like Saudi Arabia or England. Why wouldn't he want to field his guys in the States? The promoter himself tried to explain that such an important and cool fight should not belong to the USA and the whole world should see it. But in reality, Don was simply shocked by the taxes that such a fight could be imposed in America, so he decided to bring the boxers together and take them far away. Now that's the spirit of saving money. Ironically, King and the boxers were only accepted in Zaire, whose dictator Mobutu not long ago started one of the bloodiest civil wars in history. Only God, or rather the devil, knows how Don was able to persuade such a man to commit $12 million to the fight. Most likely, this way Mobutu wanted to strengthen his status, but for the promoter only the money was important. $2 million of which he immediately took for himself, and the rest he allegedly divided equally between the guys, which further raised King's status in the eyes of the rest of the boxing community. After all, such fees could only be dreamed of at that time.
I'm 32 years old, my legs are gone, this man is strong, you talking about how great he was, and now we're gonna see. Get them all out at your theaters, and you write everything you write, but I'm gonna make you eat everything you say against me, all of my critics. I'm gonna prove to the world that I'm still the fastest, the prettiest, the most classic, the most scientific, the greatest fighter of all time.
That's right.
Let's fight, right?
That's right.
Is that right?
That's right.
The investment was fully justified. Don made up a high-profile story for Muhammad to return to his historical homeland, and thanks to the star status of Rumble in the Jungle and Ali's trash talk, the fight at the time it was held was watched by 25% of the world's population. That is 1 billion people. Even today, this is still one of the most viewed sports events in history. Everybody benefited, especially in terms of reputation. The whole world now knew about Don King, and most boxers wanted to do business with his promotion company, bearing the immodest name Don King Productions. This success was especially solidified after the Thriller in Manila a year later, where Ali also defeated this time Joe Frazier in a trilogy. Muhammad made King rich and famous while having complete confidence in him. We learned from the Mobutu story that King's eloquence is the envy of any diplomat, and he knows how to approach people. In the case of the greatest, Don emphasized that they were black brothers in the world of white scoundrel and liars who could not be trusted. All business, of course, Muhammad can and should only do with Don. Thus, the King-Ali tandem took hold for a few years, but in 1978, the greatest retired to a well-deserving rest. Surprisingly, Don let him go so easily, but later he had another opportunity to earn his own. From here on out, we get to the darkest part of Don King's history. Get ready, it's gonna get hot. Robbery and deception. Just 2 years into his retirement, Muhammad was forced back into the game. By then, he had managed to squander everything he had once earned, because of the Nation of Islam. The former champion was in urgent need of money and boxing was the only solution for him. At least that's what his old friend Don convinced him, who was on the spot and agreed to make a fight between the retired boxer and the champion, Larry Holmes. At that time, King's spider network had already spread very widely, and his client list had many names, including the young heavyweight King. The promoter knew very well that Holmes was in such physical condition that he could literally kill any other top contender, and Muhammad couldn't even run 1 mile in preparation to the fight. In 2 years of retirement, he became very old, he put on weight, and he also had severe health problems. Any good friend, even an outsider, would have talked Ali out of this suicide, but boxing's top rat did things differently. In the time before the fight, the greatest lost weight, his graying head was tinted, and he had not yet forgotten how to talk and give a good promotion to the fight. The fans were waiting for the comeback of the century, and King was perfectly aware of everything and just watched. In the end, Ali was beaten for 10 rounds until Angelo Dundee saved him. And what do you think King did after that? Can you believe it? He also robbed his mentee of over $1 million. Only 2 years later, Muhammad, being in the hospital with complications, filed a lawsuit against Don, but Don preferred to pay him off with the help of Ali's old friend, Jeremy Shabazz.
I was in Don's office. Don gave me the money with specific instructions. Don't give this money to Ali unless he signs that paper.
And it was $50,000 on his desk?
Yeah, it was $50,000 cash dollars, yes.
To put it simply, Don threw Ali a bone from his desk and made it impossible for him to file any more lawsuits. When the lawyer of the greatest learned about this situation, he cried, but there was nothing he could do. It is still unknown why Muhammad signed the contract, but most likely he needed urgent money for treatment. But the greatest was of little interest for the new big daddy of the boxing world. His company was in its heyday and hundreds of talented guys were rushing to get to King, as rumor had it that only he could provide them with mountains of gold. Don's power extended to many weight classes, but he quickly realized that the real money was only in the heavyweight division, so he concentrated his attention on it. Already mentioned, Larry Holmes was robbed by King after all his big fights against Norton Spinks, Leon, and of course, Ali. Sometimes the champion was short a third of the money, sometimes more than half of it went to the promoter's hands. Also, Don often played his favorite trump card. He used to call a boxer a fee and ask the organizers for 2 or 3 times more, taking the difference for himself. Holmes repeatedly sued King, but later agreed to quite modest compensation, and as Ali in his time signed the contract. But even with such a reputation, King managed to sign more and more money-hungry boxers. For the next decades, heavyweight boxing was fully occupied by Don King and his company, which had exclusive rights to organize title fights. Apparently, the supreme powers did favor King. Otherwise, how one explained that at this time, the most terrible knockout master in the history of boxing, Mike Tyson, began his boxing journey. Since Ali's retirement, the Spider was looking for a new victim to maximize his profits, and only with the appearance of the Iron Mike, Don realized this is it. Fortunately, in the initial stages of his ascent, Tyson was under the total control of Cus D'Amato, who himself chose the surroundings of his pupil. Even Mike's manager, Jim Jacobs, was personally chosen by the trainer. However, with the death of Cus, everything changed dramatically. Initially, Mike wanted to sign with Bob Arum, but King put the same bullshit on the young guy's ear as he did to Ali. "You can't trust a white man. I'm your black brother." Tyson listened to Don, who immediately signed him to a long-term contract and began to run his own games. During his time under King, Mike became the aggressive maniac the world had imagined him to be in the second half of the 80s. Don didn't care what Tyson's reputation was as long as he was talked about. Mike would periodically get into scandals, and King would promote his fights and hit the jackpot, stealing from the star behind his back. Rumor has it that Tyson's legendary retaliation against Larry Holmes was completely fabricated by Don, who paid all his clients, including the old Ali, to get him in the ring before the fight, only to sell pay-per-views and make big money. As long as Mike had money, he didn't worry about anything, lived his life at his own pleasure, beating people up, but in 1991 he got caught up in that very unpleasant rape story. Everything that the alleged victim said initially looked very doubtful. In addition, Tyson and his team had enormous resources to hire their best lawyers and keep the case under wraps. But Don King told Mike not to worry and called a lawyer himself. And imagine, even in such a tough, demanding situation, the main rat of boxing world managed to make a profit. Vince Fuller, the financial expert to whom Don owed money, was brought in as part of Tyson's defense. Just think about the very idea. King was trying to cover his debts to Fuller by letting him, a man who had never taken such a case, defend Tyson himself. Naturally, Mike's business went downhill, and he, after months of sessions, went to jail for 4 years. And when Iron Mike tried to inquire about the status of his account, which had $100 million, he was told, "Sorry Mike, but there is no such money. You've got a lot of debt." It turned out that while his client was behind bars, Don, who had full control of the finances, had signed it over to his adopted son, Carl. Naturally, when Tyson finally got out, high-profile proceedings began.
Well, Don King was a piece of shit. This is true. And he did take advantage of me because he only did that because I allowed him to, because of my trust. You know what I mean? I'm just the person that when I'm with you, I give you my all. And I was under the impression that they were people like me. They always, I fed into the bullshit that we're together and we're brothers and we're gonna fight together. And anybody would love to accept that. Everyone wants to be a part of a family and just have a goal and accomplish a goal together. But he had different ulterior motives than I did. He's a fat piece of shit. I don't want to. No. Get off my hand. I ain't doing it, you scumbag. You.
Tyson even wrote in his autobiography that he once punched King in the street, but he still denies everything. In the end, Mike only got $14 million out of the $100 million he needed, and Don benefited again. As with the greatest, as well as Holmes and many others. King broke up with Mike as soon as he was no longer profitable. The promoter, however, did not have to grieve. He still had the power. The thriving Don King Productions did give the young guys an opportunity to make money, but on completely strange, I would say illegal terms. During the negotiations, King signed not one, but several contracts with boxers, thanks to which he was always in the black. For example, with heavyweight Tim Witherspoon, Don signed 3 contracts. On the first one, Tim gave a whopping 50% to his promoter. On the second, 30% went to Carl, Don's adopted son, whom King himself appointed to be poor Tim's manager. The third contract was a blank one, in which anything could be written up.
Don said, "Carl is me, I'm Carl." He always used that phrase, "So-and-so is me," that means that's him all the way. I never really sat down and talked with Carl about nothing. Got to do with management. He always would come to me and say, I got to ask my dad something. My dad sent me over here to see what y'all need.
It turns out that signing a contract with King was even scarier than that with Satan. With him, you at least knew that in the end, only your soul would be at stake. With Don, you could be out of everything at any time. But the thirst for money still drove people to go to this lying scoundrel. During his subsequent reign, King occasionally managed to work with Lennox Lewis, Evander Holyfield, and a major Mexican star, Julio Cesar Chavez. But every story has an ending. By the mid-2000s, Don began to be bombarded with lawsuits from everyone he had ever done business with. Everyone was demanding payments and trying to get back what was stolen by the Spider. The same Tim Witherspoon filed a lawsuit for $25 million. At first, the old man bribed and tried to pay him off, but later he realized that it would be easier to leave the world boxing scene. His time had passed. Besides, younger competitors in the face of Al Heyman and later others began to come on his tail. Don had to sell his houses to pay off his debts, but don't rush to feel sorry for him. King had time to invest in real estate and certainly wasn't poor, as he still is to this day. On top of everything else, only according to the official summary, his earnings during his work and organization of 600 title fights in the Royal Division amounted to $400 million in total. Don's fortune at some point could safely exceed $1 billion. Today, Don King is 92 years old, but he's still in business and probably still ripping off young guys, so to speak, for old time's sake. Don King's entire life has been an endless, suspenseful race for money in which he has almost always succeeded. It would be difficult to list all the tricks the promoter resorted to in his time to screw young boxers. The story of how he learned to play the piano in order to get the Klitschko brothers' attention and get them into his company stands out. However, his journey is not filled with only dark tricks. Under the guidance of the Spider, boxers began to make much bigger sums of money, and the boxing itself became a full-fledged business with its own rules. And no one knew those rules better than Don King. Yes, he is definitely the antagonist in this story, and nothing can fix the fates of boxers that he has distorted. But we have to understand that the contribution he made during his crazy career is invaluable. Like it or not, it was Don King who made boxing what it is today.